Started. Jenna, can you help us get started?
Yep, we're recording and good to go.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Carol Malice, and I'm the Executive Director of Rhode Island Bio. Thank you for tuning in this morning. We're very excited. This is our fourth Women in Science speaker series. And if you haven't been with us before, Rhode Island Bio is Rhode Island's life sciences trade organization. So we offer our members access to resources, access to capital, information sharing, and webinars like the one we're giving this morning. So we're very excited to have you all with us. And this morning's webinar is really focusing on the good guys, people who are allies to women in the workplace. And it gives me great pleasure now to introduce our moderator this morning, Patrice Milos. Patrice is, as you all know, highly recognized in the scientific community for her many achievements. And she's currently the Vice President of Scientific Operations at Pine Trees Health. And she's also the Director of the Board, Chair for the Board of Directors for Rhode Island Bio. So welcome, Patrice, and would you kick it off for us this morning?
Thank you very much, Carol. And for all of those who have joined us, it is truly a pleasure to have David Smith join us. And perhaps before I get into his introduction, I'll just use a little opportunity to say, how did I connect with David and why is he here? And it's sort of the world that we live in, and that is, as many people may know, I love Twitter and I'm always on Twitter. And I was recognizing this gentleman from Annapolis. I think you were at Annapolis at the time, David. Always sort of out there for mentorship for women and the role that men can play in helping women in the workplace. And all of a sudden, David's Twitter handle changed and he was at the Naval War College. And so I said, oh, I have to meet this gentleman. So I reached out to David via Twitter and said, David, let's have coffee. I'd love to meet, tell you about what's happening in Providence. And he reminded me that was sort of the end of the summer of 2017. So it's so exciting to have him here to talk about the work that he has done in really helping advance equity in the workplace. And so it's pleasure. So David Smith is currently a professor of sociology at the Naval War College, and he'll tell us all about that. He's an esteemed author. This is his second book, Good Guys. His first one, which was really quite a great read as well, Athena Rising, talks a lot about how men can mentor women in the workplace to help them achieve their goals. And he's followed up that a few years later with the book that's really, I think, inspired me even more, and that is Good Guys, and how men can be better allies for women in the workplace. So I'll let David introduce himself a little bit further, say hello, and sort of give us a little bit of perspective. And then this is really meant to be a conversation about David's work, and really for the people on this call, really hopefully some thoughtful and useful advice. I see we have a few male colleagues who've joined us today, which is great. I always want more, but you can give all your male colleagues David's book. So David, hello and welcome.
Thanks, Patrice. It's great to see you, although virtually. And it's just wonderful to be here with a hometown audience. You know, I don't get to do that very often, so it's great to be here with everybody in Rhode Island today. And as I'm speaking to you from lovely sunny Newport today, it's as all of you are seeing, it's just a beautiful day out there. As Patrice said, I started this work when I was at the Naval Academy, and my background, I spent a 30-year career in the Navy as a Navy pilot, doing the first 20 years of that doing typical Navy things and Navy pilot stuff, but the last 10 years as an academic, and I went back and had my PhD in sociology. And my focus has always been in social psychology, and my research has always focused on the intersection of gender, work, and family. And I started in particular looking at doing research around dual career couples as we think about decision making and how the gender perspectives of how in the family and at work and how those decisions come about. And later on, looking at retention of women and gendered career paths and in traditionally male dominated professions, including the military. And then today, working on a new research project that we're on our second part of the study now, looking at bias and performance evaluations. And the first part focused on gender bias, and the second will look at intersectionality around race and gender and performance reviews and performance evaluations. But what we're here to talk about today in particular is the work that my colleague, my co-conspirator and accomplice, Dr. Brad Johnson, and I have been working on for, the past 8 or 9 years. And Brad's a clinical psychologist. He teaches at the Naval Academy. He's been there for over 20 years. And Brad and I, as colleagues, recognized very, very early in my time teaching at the Naval Academy that we had a common connection in terms of an overlap in our research. Brad's research is always focused on mentoring and sponsoring relationships and what makes for great mentoring, sponsoring. And looking at mentoring across difference, if we can think about it more broadly that way. And recognizing the work that I was doing at the same time, we had these conversations, realized that, wow, we have this overlap. We ought to do something with this, in particular around the idea that we recognize that, often these programs and initiatives that we have out there are labeled like women's leadership initiatives and women in science and women's mentoring programs. But often men look at that and they go, that's for women. That's not for me. I don't have a role to play in any of that. And so they sit on the sidelines, or they just avoid it in a lot of ways. And it was really frustrating to us to see how hard it was to engage men in these conversations. But we look at it just kind of broadly gender equity out there. And so we decided that, well, let's focus first on the mentoring and sponsoring, and that led to Athena Rising. And so that came out in 2016. So about a year before I moved up to Rhode Island, and Brad and I were busy talking about the book and traveling, and Me Too went widespread in 2017. And as it did, we found ourselves being pulled into broader conversations about what it meant for men to show up in the workplace as allies. So not just the narrow specific functions of mentoring and sponsoring, which are important, but just the broader idea of how do we show up as colleagues, as allies, as friends in the workplace at whatever level of leadership we're in. And so we set out to do that research starting in 2017, which led to our book that just came out in October, and that's Good Guys, and which we had the great fortune to interview people like Patrice here.
I have to say, I remember talking to you about the project and reflecting, the questions you were asking, are there particular examples of where men have been an ally for you in the workplace? And I could point to several that really made a difference in my career. We'll talk a little bit about those. I do want to frame our discussion even a little bit more, though, too, David, because in the book, and I love the way you describe it, the workplace is built for men. And we are still trying to figure out as women how to fit into that workplace versus what the workplace needs to do for women so that it works for both men and women. And I love your discussion about, when you were in Annapolis and you looked around in your class and you realized how few women there were. I mean, that's sort of just to recognize that. I mean, maybe talk just a little bit about what you saw and why it becomes so important to change some of that mindset.
Yeah, and it really was. It was kind of my first, I did grow up in a military family, so I moved a lot. And so I've seen a lot of parts of the country and other countries as well as a kid, growing up in school. But one of the things that I think was always common to my experiences was that, it was a balance from a gender perspective. It was always kind of a balanced perspective in terms of, and I guess, yes, there were differences when it came to things like sports. And yes, there were boys and girls teams when it came to sports. But other than that, everything we did academically was always connected. And then, I think back to my high school years in particular, that in having the fortune to be in some honors programs, and those that I looked around that classroom and I think back, and they were dominated by women.
Yes.
Girls probably back then, you would think at that age, but yeah. And I look today and I think about those classmates of mine who are, a lot of them are medical doctors and lawyers and professionals and vice presidents and CEOs, and they're doing incredible things out there in the world. But so that was kind of the world that I grew up in, and I felt like that was my normal. But coming into the military and going to the Naval Academy in the early '80s, when we were in the first years of assimilating women into the service academies, was a very, very eye-opening, shocking experience to be in an environment in many cases where it was only guys. And it was kind of weird in many ways, and to talk about women, and women were not in the room ever. And in many of the conversations when women were around, right, it was very open. The misogyny and the sexism was just very rampant. And it was very easy to talk about it because there was nothing to hold anyone back then.
Yeah.
And it was just really eye-opening and shocking to see that, how we would treat. And again, these women, oh, by the way, had to jump through more hoops and reach higher standards. And I'm not telling anybody in this audience anything they haven't heard before than men ever did. Just to be, because back then they were limited in the numbers that could even go in.
Yeah.
So to me, it was just shocking to see that. And the way that they were treated was that sense of, it's not right. It's not fair. It's not just. And we shouldn't be doing that.
And not to dwell on the military, but I was struck by the 60 Minutes piece that was on Sunday night. And, our discussion really here is focusing on male allies for women. But I think that it is important to think about the same context for people of color, LGBTQ, the whole concept of people who are not in the majority. And how we can all rise together. It's not just about women and male allies for women, but it's the learnings that can be translated to all other diversity and inclusion initiatives that we face. So anyway, let's focus then on the topic of male allyship. I mean, first of all, let's get over it. We always talk about mentorship. It's great. Everybody should have a mentor, but to really, really make a difference, I think, in diversity and inclusion, this concept of allyship is so important. So maybe why don't you define that a little bit for us, David, and what you mean, so that everybody has that context.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. We look at allyship in two kind of broad categories. And the first is what we call interpersonal allyship. And this is really individually, how do we show up in the workplace and the kinds of relationships, and if we're talking about it from a gender perspective, men have with women, and being supportive and collaborative in your relationships, and supporting initiatives and work towards creating gender equity and fairness and justice. And a lot of the guys that we talked to, these senior men, they said that, this was really the easy part of allyship, because I only have to worry about myself. I only have to hold myself accountable in doing this work. The harder part is the second part of allyship. And this is what we talk about as public allyship or systemic allyship. And it's not, and guys said, this is really hard, because I felt like they were having to put some skin in the game. They were accepting some personal and professional risk. It made them uncomfortable in a variety of different ways. And they said, because it's not just about me. Now I have to hold others accountable. Now I have to hold my team, my organization accountable, my leaders accountable. And that really does require you to put some skin in the game as we think about that. The systemic piece is also, as they began to understand and talk about, as they began to understand how bias was taking place and was part of a variety of everyday practices and processes or policies they even had in their organization. Once they recognized those, they felt, okay, now I also have to take those on, because now I'm aware of them. Now I have to fix those. I have to correct, I have to change the process, the practice, so that it's equitable for everyone. And often that's a lot of hard work, because you think about tackling something like pay equity. and we had a great interview in there from for the state of Massachusetts in particular, as they tackled that a few years ago, and the really hard work that went on for decades to get to finally getting these kinds of solutions. It's hard work to get there. And so this is how guys talked about allyship and women, and as much as you referred to there with your own interview, that we were looking for very specific examples that exemplified what those look like. Specifically, what is very tactical actions that you can take right now, right here, and apply in just about any setting.
Yeah, it's really great. And I reflect, I was looking at the book again today, and one of our good friends, Bob Coughlin, we talked a little bit about, is nicely quoted in different parts of the book. But he says, if you want to change how things, I'm just reading it, if you want to change how things are, you have to change how you do things. And in fact, Bob is one of the first people that stood up and said, I will not be on a panel that is only men. I will not allow Mass Bio to hold panels that are only men. And I will not sit on boards that are only men. And he said it so publicly. And it was like created a whole different dialogue. And that, and Bob is constantly looking to create allyships for women in his organization throughout the life sciences industry, which we are all a part of. So, I mean, I think that's a great example. I mean, you might want to talk about another example or two that, as you reflect, David, on some of the things that you learned or heard.
Yeah, Bob's examples were great. And, I think one of the follow on to him not, participating in and being on panels or on boards that were all men was and I think we included this in the book too. I'm trying to remember what's in the book and what was from the interview that I'm remembering from my mind. But he talked about how he would turn around and he would say, however, I'm not going to participate, but here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to connect you with 3 or 4 extremely qualified and more qualified than me women who were going to add so much to your panel, to your board, and I'm going to open up my network, and I'm going to make these connections for you and help you to do that. And so it's not just there's the kind of disrupting the status quo as we talk about it, right? This is the way it's always been. It's these manels, these all men conference boards out there. That's one thing to say, hey, I'm not going to participate. But the next step, right, then make the connection. The advocacy piece is so critical and important. And when men talk about other people, in particular women, in this case, it makes a difference out there. And guys, in some ways, are not comfortable talking about it in a variety of different ways. So I think it's really important. And I've done some of those same things that Bob has advocated for in the same way. I did it for a large bank in our own state here once when they asked me to participate in a military veterans ERG panel they did. It was a great event they were setting up. And a friend of mine who worked there said, hey, we'd love to have you on the panel to talk about this. And I said, I looked at the panel and I said, it's all white dudes.
Yeah.
I would love to participate. However, I think you need some other perspectives on there to make this a better panel. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to connect you with some people, and I think that'll help you make it better. And they went back, they brought they included 2 women on the panel, 2 women vets. And then they came back and said, hey, could we still get you to be on the panel now that we have some diversity? I said, sure, I'd love to. Okay. And so we did. And it was great to hear the comments from people in the audience afterwards. We're all mingling afterwards to hear them talking about, wow, it was so incredible to hear these women vets talk about their experiences and how in many ways they were so different from the guys up there. And they were like, wow, what a great idea to include women vets. And I was like, see, if we could just start thinking outside, right, our normal network, our normal circle, that it's so important.
Right. And it really is. We talked a little bit about, before we formally started, where women are right now in the face of this pandemic. And the great fear that many of us have that the accomplishments and the success that women have had we're now backwards because so many women have left the workplace. again, because of the challenges of the rules of the workplace. And your perspective on that, I'd love to hear too, David, and how allies are going to help us get this back.
Yeah, and we've really, all the advances around gender equity and equality we made in the workplace. We're back into 1980s era, in terms of women's labor force participation today. And I think I was mentioning earlier that the fact that tomorrow is equal pay day, based off the 81 cents that women earn for every dollar that a man earns. But I just heard some recent, an update to that said that because of the pandemic, that has been shifted and now has been updated to be 76 cents. So we may see a shift here in what equal pay day is out there. But the other thing is that the language we use about this being women choosing to leave the workforce. And I do think that there might be some people who get an opportunity to choose, but I think many women are feeling forced out of the workforce because they're being forced to choose between taking care of their family and earning a paid check out there. And I think we just need to recognize that we in our corporations and our companies and our society, we need to be thinking about how this is affecting people differently. And even within those numbers, we think about the millions. I think we're up to like over 5 million women we've lost out of the workforce since the pandemic started. That the vast majority of those are women of color.
Yeah.
And so again, disaggregating the data a little bit is helpful to begin to, as we think about how do we target solutions in particular. And too often, our country has looked at caregiving and, child care being part of that, but more broadly, caregiving has been women have been the social safety net of the U.S.
Yes.
And we have to, there's a movement afoot in the country today to change that, grassroots efforts to engage the new administration in the White House and, and many cases at the state level too, to begin to shift this conversation about what childcare, what caregiving is all about, and how do we begin to include men in this conversation as well, because that was part of the conversation we had in particular for the book. It was really clear that if we're going to talk about allyship and really creating equity in the workplace, especially around gender, we can't just sling on our ally capes as guys in the workplace and go, okay, I'm here to save the day and I'm here to be your ally. And then when I go home, take my ally cape off and then go back to, the status quo,
Yes.
which is reinforcing and perpetuating a lot of the differences and the inequities that are being transferred back into the workplace. So we have got to start at home. And this starts with guys doing their fair share when it comes to domestic responsibilities, caregiving, and certainly the third shift, as we see today, of homeschooling.
Yes.
Hopefully we're turning that corner.
It's really tough when you think about it. For dual career couples with 2 or 3 kids at home, I don't know how I could do it. I think the role of dual career couples is a really important one because more and more the world is dual career couples, and how do you find a partner that is equally an ally to you or you to them, and how important that is and translates into your success in the workplace as well is really, really important. You talked a little bit about that, the fact that your wife is also in the military, and how important it is to be able to be equally supportive of each other is really important, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And, we certainly see that with dual career couples that sometimes, as people are partnering and they find that they think they know their partner, but things seem to change quite a bit once children enter into the equation. And some of those maybe verbal agreements have shifted, and now you start to see another side to your partner and what that looks like. And I think that's one where, again, we have to get back to some of the changes and shifts that have to happen within the workplace to support the expectations of what The new generation, and not that the Gen X, Gen Y, and maybe a few of the baby boomers that are still out there working that don't expect, but certainly millennials and Gen Z today entering the workforce have different expectations about how they're going to combine work and family and what gender roles look like.
Yes.
And I'm proud to say that, I've raised a couple of those, and I think you have too
Yeah.
that are out there, and that, the problem is they get out there with these more inclusive perspectives and ideas about this, and attitudes. The research shows attitudes are shifting when it comes to this.
Yes.
Behavior has not shifted yet, and that's the challenge because they're entering into a very traditional workforce.
Yeah, and it's funny because I do see that. I see my son, who now is at, one of the top law firms in the country, frankly, in the world, and all norms are gone now. He's first year in law. I don't know how many hours a week he works, and that's just what you have to do, whether you're male or female. Now, there are female partners, but there aren't many, and he knows that. And I'm always, and he's always mindful of making sure that there are women who are coming in at his level as well. But you fit into the workplace that as it exists, and it's a male's today. Still, it's a male workforce. I think, though, having allies becomes really important, because the question really becomes, many of those allies will have power and they'll have influence. And we'll come back to a few questions that we're getting. But it takes a very strong individual to decide that they're willing to share that. And so, do you see that? How do you see that? These allies who are saying, I see some people who I need to really stand up for. What does that ally mean? What do they do for those individuals that they're an ally for? Is a fun topic.
Yeah, and the advocacy piece is an interesting one. So there's several things that come into play as we think about maybe what keeps men from being better allies in terms of being better advocates.
Yes.
For women. And this is such an important part because we all need great advocates and sponsors, right? Many of the opportunities that many of us have had out there have been because of that. And part of this, the one of the hard parts of this in particular is what we call, you've got to begin to recognize, how much of the P word that you have, and that's privilege. We don't even call it, we can't even, around male audiences, it's really hard to talk about privilege. Yeah. Because it does become very cumbersome. But as guys begin to understand and to see how, as they really develop an awareness of how other people experience the workplace, and we say this is one of the beginning places where we have to begin with allyship on our journey here, is you have to begin to develop an awareness of how these other people experience it differently than you do, and then why. And I think that really begins to open up people's eyes to then okay, so now what can I do, right? If you have this understanding and I have a motivation to do the work, now I can begin to understand how can I apply my social capital, my privilege, the things that I have in my arsenal to again advance people who don't necessarily look like me. But there's a lot of things holding some people back, and we certainly find the idea around zero-sum bias, right? That suddenly how, for women to advance, that somehow as men, we lose, right? We have to lose. That this idea of a fixed size pie is just a terrible notion to think about to begin with, because we all know that as we diversify our workforce, everybody wins, men, women, and the company and the society.
It's business smarts.
Yeah.
I mean, I just see it in different interactions that I have on boards.
Sure.
And it's the mutual differences that then bring strength to that organization.
Yep.
There was one, and so I remember, and I'll use the example that I gave you. Young in my career, I had taken maternity leave, and there was, unbeknownst to me, my boss, who was my ally, was in the discussion around promotions. And at that meeting, there was an individual who said, Well, Patrice took 3 months off of maternity leave. So, there should be a longer time frame, therefore, when she should be considered for a promotion. And he stood up and said, we cannot do that. She is demonstrating all these, and on and on. But the fact is, he came back and he told me about this discussion, so that all of a sudden I understood what was happening, and that I knew that I had an advocate and an ally. I was very fortunate as a boss. I did get the promotion. But imagine those discussions that happen for promotions where you don't know what goes on in the room. And this happens all the time. So the real question is, how do you understand the role of an ally? What can you expect from your ally? Do you name your ally? I mean, all the things that, is, and, you can read the book, folks, because there's a lot of good tips. But I think it's just interesting. When do you really know you have an ally?
Yeah, and sometimes you don't, right? Sometimes allies are doing that work in spaces where you don't see them. Much like if your boss had not said anything to you, you would have never
Yeah.
known.
Right.
And we find that quite a bit. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of times when there are these spaces where it's just men in those conversations, and these are opportunities. And we tell guys that, hey, if you're an ally and when you're in those spaces, if you're not talking about her, if you're not being her raving fan, if you're not pushing her forward and showing that she's the best person for this, then you're not being a true ally. Because men are often subject to what we call the wimp penalty. They are concerned about this idea that somehow by advocating for women or for being a proponent of gender equity, being public about these kinds, being associated with these programs, that somehow they're going to be penalized. There isn't, the research isn't real clear on it. It's very mixed about whether they actually get any penalties or not. The reality is that we find that that men actually benefit in many ways by doing this kind of work, and especially when it comes to not just the advocacy, but the confronting and disrupting piece of this. So when bias or sexism or these jokes are made or things are said there, something is, even the microaggressions that are done in meetings all the time, a woman gets interrupted, right? Is that bias? It's biased behavior because women get interrupted 3 times as much as men.
Yeah.
But if you say something about it, if you call a guy out for doing that, you're going to get penalized.
Yes.
You're going to get all this feedback, and you're going to get called bossy or your other favorite B words out there, yes. Right? Yes. And as a guy, if I do it, I don't get penalized. Worst case, it's kind of neutral. In some cases, guys get a bump up in their performance reviews, or they're seen as a gender champion, they're seen as an ally. So they really don't have, it feels like they're risking, but they're really not.
Right. And it's funny because, again, I'll go back to a piece in the book where Laura Adams, who many of us know and really so enjoyed working with her in her work at the Rhode Island Quality Institute. And she talks about her ally, who was her board chair. Yeah. And she said it was a two-way street. She was as much an ally for him. When he was willing to stand up for her, she was willing to stand up for him. And, men need it too sometimes, because it's, we're all struggling with many of the same things. And so I think it's a two-way street. That's why I like to think that men benefit from being an ally as much as the women who they are an ally for is equally important. So yeah. I think that's good. And it is good to call that out. And it is good, to say, I appreciate what George has done for me in my career. And it really is an aspirational, for them as well. So I think it is important. So you must see that.
Yeah, the benefits from allyship, and this is one of the reasons why it's like, how do you get men maybe who are sitting on the sideline, don't see why they should be doing this work around gender equity? This is one of you talk about the benefits of allyship for guys, and this is one of them, is that you're creating your own allies, this inner circle. Men and women talked about, having a gender confidant, somebody who's got your back, somebody who's covering, who's there for you, somebody who's gonna say, hey, you know, today when you said that in the meeting and all the women kind of rolled their eyes, here's why. And it's like, oh, thank God, you know, somebody who, and Laura talked about this in her, you know, she had a inner circle of men in particular that she could go to and they could have these conversations. She talked about it as carefrontation. And we love that concept, that idea that you know, you're kind of confronting people about who they are and what they're doing, but you're doing it from a place of care, you know. And I think that's really important, that men, the way that men benefit, you know, besides, you know, a lot of these things lead to better leadership broadly, and because they get access to information they wouldn't have otherwise had, because it's coming from a different perspective. They get pulled into more diverse networks, and again, they're connected to people they wouldn't otherwise have seen, you know, been connected to, different perspectives. And I think the most important part of this is that as men who are more often in these allies and more in these relationships with women in the workplace, they, you know, they just have better interpersonal skills, more empathy, better emotional intelligence, more communication skills. And gosh, that makes you a better parent and partner too, by the way.
You know, what's so fascinating is, I'll reflect for a moment. I have a great friend, and it's on Twitter, so I'm not the least bit, you know, hesitant to speak about it. But a good friend, Bruce Booth, who's Life Science VC, Twitter, he's been doing, oh gosh, 10 years. Amazing, amazing data, understanding of CEOs. He's at Atlas Ventures, influential, starter of so many companies. And he shared his experience over his recent divorce with us in this blog that he does once a month. And his world was changed upside down over the last year. And the fact that he was able to, in many respects for the first time, like bare his soul and all of a sudden show that we really don't know what's happening in the workplace, how other people are feeling, and the need to bring empathetic leadership to the workplace was one of the most amazing experiences to read and hear from Bruce, because I think we as women leaders are worried about being empathetic leaders, but right now that's what the world needs, frankly. We need to understand our employees. We need to understand they're going through some very challenging times. We need to be advocates for them and for, you know, things. So we have lots of questions, but I do want, before we get into the questions, just talk about a few things. The solutions, and you talk about it in your book. I bet many of the women on this call don't have male allies. Maybe they do, but if you don't, how do you find one that can be your advocate?
Yeah, great question. And we talk with audiences of women about this quite a bit. And first of all, most of you probably know, look around in your organization, you probably know that guy who kind of gets it already. And that's a great place to start. And in the same way that, you know, when we interviewed women for the book For Good Guys, and asked them about, hey, who are some of these guys? Who are they? Most women had no problem identifying who they were right off the top, just like Patrice did. And but it's interesting, you know, when we went to those men to ask them and to talk to them about this interview, most of them they didn't necessarily identify with being an ally. They didn't really see themselves as being an ally. They talked about it as like, that's just who I am as a leader. That's just the right thing to do. You know, all of these conversations about kind of who they are and their brand, about who they are as a person. Others did know, you know, some of the ideas around allyship, but it is a term that not everybody necessarily identifies with, but you do. You all know them. Start with those guys, encourage them, call them out when they're doing some of the good things, and then engage them in conversations about this to open their eyes to some of the things that are going on out there. Be that, you know, meet them halfway and being that collaborative, supportive relationship that you have in the workplace. Not that women need to be out there teaching guys, but gosh, you know, when you mentor junior men, it makes a difference out there. And I know you're all trying to mentor a lot of the women out there. But gosh, if you can include a few of these young men out there, junior men coming into your organization, maybe you see a little bit of promise in this person to go somewhere. And it's like, here's an opportunity to shape him in a way that really makes a difference. Do that. And I think one of the places that we see lots of opportunities take as companies are expanding employee resource groups or business resource groups, however you define them. These are great places. Invite men into the conversation. So many ERGs today are finding ways to include men in their programming, to make it more of a conversation about gender. And again, ERGs are an interesting place because they've been notionally, traditionally created as a safe place for women to have these conversations and understand how to network, look for resources, overcome challenges. But I think if we're going to advance this conversation, we've got to start increasing the amount of interaction. And so we see even ERGs today where they're creating subgroups of male allies.
Yes.
So one of my favorites that Brad and I have worked with was Bayer Monsanto, and they have a Women in Science and Engineering ERG, which is a huge ERG across the world. But over the last few years, they had several men who were participating in that, and they decided they would create a male ally subgroup of it. And I love their acronym. They call it WISE Guys. So just love the title. But again, the focus there of doing it together, they have co-chairs where there's one man who's a co-chair of WISE, one woman who's a co-chair of WISE Guys. They coordinate on their programming. And collaborate and do a lot of things together. So it really does build in that inherent collaboration, and ERGs are just one of those great places you can start.
Yes, really great. So let's go to a few questions because we have several. And Michelle Kozak has asked a question: how do we encourage early career men and women to take risks in standing up for equity? She said, many of the examples we've talked about are more senior male allies and helping with advancing more senior women. But, opportunities for early career scientists, how can we make sure that happens?
Yeah, we had several examples of that in Good Guys, and really seeing how they applied this personally for them. And I think one of the keys here is obviously role modeling. So again, people role modeling this behavior in the workplace does show, because I will tell you that the research is really clear that men, when they're in a group of other men in particular, but even sometimes in a mixed gender group, when they hear a sexist comment or some sort of inappropriate joke or bias is made there, they all understand it. They all recognize it right off the bat. And then they're just like, well, what do we do? What do we do? And they're looking around the room to see if anybody else is going to say anything. One of the things that holds people back is this understanding or expectation that everybody else has a high acceptance of this, that the other men in the room have a high acceptance of this. So the reality is that they don't. It just takes one person to say something, and suddenly it changes the entire environment. It's like, oh, thank God you said something, because I totally disagree with that, and I was incredibly offended by it. And I can't believe you said that in front of our colleagues here. And it just takes somebody to step forward and role model what that looks like out there. And I think we've got to be doing more of it.
Kind of the
oh, you can have fun with it.
Thing. Yeah, exactly. Of doing it, and
humor is a great way to do it if that's part of your brand and what you can naturally do.
Yes, it's true. Interesting. Another comment, which is I think a really interesting one, and Alyssa brought this up, saying I've had really wonderful male allies in the workplace, but one issue that I do encounter at times is when you're trying to network with a potential male ally, how can it can be misinterpreted as you're being friendly, or you're, there's some level of romantic, and just things that are like not the intention at all. How do you overcome some of those potential misinterpretations? Because, it's hard for that sort of collegial relationship in some situations.
And it's interesting, this works both directions. We hear this from women and from men. And lots of this went into the conversations around for Athena Rising. We had in particular for, how do I begin, for example, if you want to start a mentoring relationship, it's kind of the same thing. It's if if a guy asks that, all right, so what's he mean when he's making this offer? And if she asks, what is she looking for if she's making this offer, and this idea that there's something else going on there. And the same thing goes for allyship when it comes to friendships or other collegial types of relationships, that
Yes.
there's a concern that there might be the perceptions are out there. For the guys, what we tell them in particular is that for them, they need to remember that, okay, well, don't feed the fire of perception. Right? So again, we can't do everything. We can't always stop perceptions, but don't feed it. And so, for example, if you're doing mentoring, don't mentor one woman, mentor lots of women. And it's just part of your brand about who you are. And the same thing goes with allyship. I would tell you, if you look at my network and my circles, my social media network, my colleagues that I work with, the people that I co-author with and do research with, I'll bet you it's more than 50% women. I would venture it's pretty safe bet.
Yes.
Nobody ever, I don't get these challenges. It's not an issue for me. It's when you isolate, right? And and I think this is part of the getting started when you get started doing this work, is making sure you're very clear. But this is a conversation that in particular for men, we need to be having, because, there's this idea that somehow, what happens, and guys fear this, what happens if I suddenly am attracted to a woman at work? And, Brad and I kind of chuckle when we hear this, and like, well, feelings of attraction are normal. Okay. First of all, and if you work with lots of people in your organization, I would be really surprised if you didn't have some attractive people who worked with you. And so the question is not so much, what do win or what, but what do you do with it in the moment? And we always like to remind guys, it's like, look, you got a frontal lobe, use it. You can actually, we have, I think it's helpful to have a little fun with this, that you can understand your feelings of attraction and then use some good executive decision making about what am I going to do about that in the moment. And the other one is some great social psych research, which is kind of fun too, and it looks at mutual attraction. And so in experimental conditions where they go in with groups of men and women, and they ask people to rate each other on how attractive they find the other person. And then they flip the question and ask, okay, so how much do you think the other person finds you attractive? Well, as it turns out, there's one gender that overestimates how much they think the other gender finds them attractive. And yes, it's us guys. And so we tell male audiences out there, it's like, look, we're going to joke about this, but she's just not that into you. Okay. So get over it.
Yeah.
If you can just start with that as a starting point, you're probably going to be way better off.
Yeah. It is interesting though. Another comment was, the fact that often men are in leadership roles and they don't offer the opportunities because they think that the women will say no because of family. And this is such a fallacy that is, again, I think it's some of this, a little bit of power. Oh, she's not going to want to do that. I'll ask my friend, the buddy down the street, down the block, down the hallway or whatever. This is really something we need to get over.
Yeah, and it's really about kind of perceptions of how we see each other as part of it, that these implicit associations, biases that we have, that and we also, there's a great social psych phenomenon out there called the women are wonderful effect. And so when men talk about women, if you ask them to describe some of the women they work with, and say, oh, they're great, they're caring and they're nurturing and they're compassionate, but what they're not saying is they're not tough as nails and they're great leaders and they can take on anything, right? And that's a problem, because guys don't see women, and this goes into leadership style too, right?
Yeah.
Women's leadership styles are evaluated differently than men, and so that we have to get past these and understand what these look like and why. And men will withhold sponsorship and advocacy, just like you're talking about, because they also fear that she's a risky investment. This is kind of that idea that suddenly I'm going to lose her at some point. Young women deal with this all the time because there's this perception that, well, she's going to get married or she's going to have kids, and then that's the end of it. One guy, believe it or not, described his younger female colleagues as ticking time bombs of maternity, that suddenly they were just going to start popping out babies. And it's like, well, okay, they might, but I don't think that's something we need to worry about here when it comes to this job. And then there's the flip side. The last part of this is really about sometimes guys think that they are helping. They're being kind of gender savvy. I get it. I'm trying to be a good ally, and they miss the cue here. And there's a great story we got to interview the director of NASA because his mentee at the time was Janet Petro. She was deputy, I think she's still down, deputy director of the Kennedy Space Center, and Robert Lightfoot was the director of NASA, the administrator at the time. And he said, I always kind of prided myself as this gender savvy dude who got it, and I was there to help. I was part of the solution. And he said, I was on a hiring committee, and it was clear we were down to the final four candidates. The woman candidate was the best candidate by a mile. And he said before they were getting ready to make the offer, he just wanted to, he thought, hey, I'll show them how gender savvy I am. And he says, before we do this, I just want to point out that this job requires a lot of travel. And, she just had a baby. And he said, fortunately for him, there was this woman on the committee sitting right across from him, and just like flames coming out of her eyes. And she just looked at him and said very calmly, Robert, she's a really smart woman applying for this job. And I'm pretty sure she knows that it requires a lot of travel. And I'm really sure she knows she had a baby a couple of weeks ago. So if that's the case, why don't we just let her make that decision?
Yes.
And he was just like, aha,
Yeah.
epiphany, that it's like, here I was trying to be helpful, and I was actually hurting in this case.
Yeah.
And he said he loves to tell that story, and we share it quite often, because this is part of good allies too. This is humility and showing that, hey, I am not perfect. I make mistakes along the way.
Yeah.
And I've got to keep that learning orientation going, and then sharing my aha moments with others, right? So we can all learn from them.
Yeah. And just some other comments too. The fact that men in the workplace with daughters all of a sudden have a new appreciation for the challenges their daughters will face, and they kind of stand up and pay attention.
Daughters are an interesting one. So first, the research shows that one of the strongest motivations for being an ally, getting involved and doing the work around equity, is a personal connection. So it tends to be a family member or a colleague or a mentee or somebody that you have a close relationship. They share with you, or you see these injustices that are done, and it motivates you. Right? It motivates, like, that's not right, and I'm going to make it right. I'm going to fix it. I'm going to get involved and do something about this, which is great. And so by the way, this is one of the things that for senior leaders, CEOs in particular, we start with them and say, look, you need to get comfortable talking about this topic, and start with your personal narrative about why this is important to you. Tell me your elevator pitch. Tell me your story about why this is important to you. And then I want you to connect it to the business. Show me, so every other manager in that room goes, oh, okay, it's not only personally important to you, but it's important to us as a business too. And so really important. The issue with daughters is really interesting. Guys in a variety of different spaces and conferences and places have been literally booed off the stage for talking about, well, the reason I'm an advocate today is because of my, when my daughter was born.
Yeah.
And they're like, really, dude, you had to have a daughter before you could really care about the way the rest of us experience the workplace. And I totally get that. But what I love the comment, and so thank you for making it here, that it is important though, and I do think it's a great place to start, is understanding that personal connection is a great place to get people motivated to do the work. And if it takes a guy having a daughter, I'll take it. I'll take them for whatever gets them in the door, and will listen and open their ears and listen to do the work.
That's good. I know we're coming up to the hour, so I want to be mindful. I know everybody's schedules are busy. I just have one sentence from the book that I love, and that's, gender inequities are not women's issues, they are leadership issues. And I think what we're looking for are leaders at every level throughout a career that can be supportive of each other, be an ally. And David, your work is amazing, your and Brad's work. I could talk about this forever because it's so much part of the solution of where we need to get to. I think we've answered most people's questions. And I really want to thank you, and maybe Carol, if you want to have a few parting wisdoms, but thank you, thank you, thank you, David. I know you travel the globe, and we are so privileged to have had the opportunity to hear you. I hope it's the start of, fun discussions of the future, and best of luck with your work. Carol?
Thank you. Thank you, Patrice, for leading this discussion. And David, it sounds like you're going to have a lot of advice for us as we move forward with mentoring and creating more male allies. So thank you. And everyone, you can buy David's book on Amazon. So if you're interested in reading more, David, do you want to just give the title to everyone again?
Yeah, it's Good Guys, How Men Can Be Better Allies for Women in the Workplace.
So thank you again. And I want to thank the Venture Cafe, including the team, Toonie, Jenna and Amy. Always great to work with you. Really fun to co-sponsor this event with you. And thank you to Amgen, our series sponsor, for sponsoring this session. So everyone, please tune in next week for our Rhode Island Innovator Series. We're going to give a vaccine update next Tuesday. And I'm very excited to share that Epivax, one of our local companies, will be talking about vaccine generation and the business side of the vaccine, as well as we have Carrie LaPlante, who is a member of the Rhode Island Department of Health Vaccine Advisory Committee. She'll give their perspective. And we have one of the founding members of the Pfizer team that developed the Pfizer vaccine. So he'll be really interesting and exciting to hear from. So please register online for this event. And again, thank you, Patrice, David, and everyone that tuned in today. Hope you all stay well, and we'll see you hopefully next week.
Great. And again, thank you, David, so much. Your work is just so inspirational. Enjoy your day, everybody.
Thank you, Patrice. Thank you, Carol.
Okay.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.